You should look at things from multiple viewpoints, not just one or two. The idea that people say, oh, there's two sides to everything. Actually, there's hundreds of sides to everything. There's no two ways to look at things alone. It's actually a spiritual exercise. You look at things in multiple dimensions as much as possible. And that's a tradition in the Jewish tradition and the mystical traditions around the world. You don't just look at it from one dogmatic point of view. In fact, dogma is one of the huge problems that the world faces, is overcoming the dogmas that have got entrenched into different societies.
Ivan Tyrrell, welcome to the Conciliators Guild podcast. Ivan, we're very happy to have you here. We're looking forward to a very rich discussion. Ivan, you are the co-founder of the Human Givens School of Wellbeing and Psychotherapy, along with Joe Griffin. You're a founder and director of the Conciliators Guild itself, a writer, among many, many other things. We're very much looking forward to your views about the world today, about psychology, about the relationships between psychology and politics, about a lot of big picture issues that I know that you have some really, really interesting views on. So we're looking forward to all that. If I can start, Ivan, in a way at the basics, which is the human givens idea, could you tell us a bit about it, about how you and Joe Griffin came up with the idea, why you came up with it, what its benefit has been in terms of psychology and well-being in the United Kingdom and elsewhere? Why don't we start there as a baseline?
Okay, happy to, John. We came up with this idea because both Joe and I were very frustrated with the state of psychotherapy in this country. This is, 25 years or so ago, a long time ago now. But there were all sorts of peculiar practices going on. For example, false memory syndrome was a rage where people were going around saying that every human psychological problem or emotional problem was the result of parents sexually abusing their children. Some psychotherapists were teaching this to NHS staff. That was just one example. So we started talking about, there's so much knowledge in the world about what human beings are and how they can be helped. We could surely do a better job than the current forms of psychotherapy were doing. I mean, psychodynamic therapy, for example, was harming a lot of people through those kind of ideas, constantly going back in the past instead of helping people move forward into the future. So that kind of thinking led us to coming up with the starting point of basic natural law, which is that all living things, which includes us, but also plants, insects, fish, animals, etc., have to take in nutriment from the environment. And they have to take that in not just to grow, but also to maintain themselves. So that was our starting point. And then we looked at, well, what are the forms of nutriment? Well, one, of course, is physical. You need food, you need water, you need space, you need air to breathe, and so on. These are fundamental physical needs that need to be catered for in human beings, as in animals. And the second one, which is more complex in us, but does also appear in animals, is that we have emotional needs. And these emotional needs are equally as important in a different way, but in a kind of complex sort of society that we have, very important. So, for example, we have a need for security. We need to feel safe. It doesn't mean to say we can't take risks, but we need to feel that we can lay our head down at night and not get killed or eaten by a predator or a wild human being. We have a need for community. We need to be connected to the wider community. We need intimacy in our lives, friendships, and a partner and all that sort of thing. And that's another need. We need to feel competent, that we can achieve something. And we need meaning in our lives. Very important that we have meaning and purpose in our lives. And we've gone into much detail in these in our Human Givens book. which has been updated with more research that confirms these ideas. So that's the basic idea. And we found that when we were working with distressed, depressed, anxious, angry, addicted people, using that as a base point and teaching them about the need that they had that was causing the problem because it wasn't being met, we were getting much better results than, and research showed this as well, than traditional sort of psychotherapy, psychodynamic therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and all the other forms of therapy. We were getting just terrific results with the intelligent people that we were training to go out and use these ideas. So that's really where it started. But of course, once you've got something working in the world, which we had, which is a better form of psychotherapy, which is also being used in schools to help teachers teach better, teach their children more effectively, you start to think about, well, how could this apply to the wider world, especially a world that's in great stress at the moment, one way and another, what with wars and fear-based propaganda from governments to the populations and so on. So that's a sort of an introduction to the ideas.
Well, it sounds like a lot of common sense, Ivan, which is also, I think, a virtue of what you guys have done is that these are real needs. They're alive in all of us, and that's where your focus is in the Human Givens approach. What, speaking of the sort of state of the world, what happens to people when these emotional needs, well, even the physical ones, are not met? And so how does that translate into problems in the world at the individual and the societal level?
Well, the first thing that happens if some fundamental needs aren't being met, even things like for food, but also for these emotional needs, is that you get anxious. And anxiety produces stress hormones and can lead to more serious forms of mental and emotional distress, various forms of anxiety disorders, depression of various levels, and even psychotic breakdowns. You can transpose that into society. If you look around now, there's a sort of what is called free-floating anxiety. There is a great amount of anxiety amongst ordinary people now partly because of the propaganda and the advertising and the media and so on, promoting, they say things, should we be afraid of this? Should we be afraid of that? In articles, Well, they're often things you never even thought about until they raise the topic, which creates a sort of feeling amongst ordinary people that there are a lot of things to be afraid of. And then there's wars starting up in the Middle East, in Ukraine and Russia, and in the Far East there are wars, and there's horrible wars at the moment in Africa, really, massacres all over the place. And all those knowledge about all those things raises people's general anxiety levels. You have to remember that in the past, there could be wars going on across the channel, and the vast majority of people in this country would never hear about them until perhaps a few years later, because of the problems of transporting people with the messages from the continent to the UK and then spreading it around the UK. Not easy until the invention of printing and stagecoaches going up and down the country and so on. So free-floating anxiety is one of the problems the current world and the politicians and the media are generating, and also it's coming out of social media as well. People seem to delight in frightening themselves. Some people do.
It's this notion of free-floating anxiety, I think, is worthwhile exploring, because the term free-floating means it's sort of just out there, and a lot of people have it, and it's not necessarily pinned onto something. It's not an actual anxiety that is related to a specific problem in my life. It's like a cloud that we're all living in, if you wish. Is that about right?
It is a sort of, almost like a vapor that we're all breathing. And you can come across, an example of this was during COVID, where I remember walking down the village street and meeting some people where we're all supposed to be locked in, but you're allowed out for 1 hour or something. And we went for a walk. And we met some other people, and they insisted on standing in the middle of the road while they were talking to us because, you had to be 2 or 3 meters apart. And one of them suddenly said, "Are we allowed to be doing this?" Now, I was brought up with the notion that this is a free country. You can do what you like. But that's no longer acceptable. It's no longer a completely free country. And the problem that we all face now is bureaucracy. The rules being made by people who have no knowledge of um, the front line problems that people are quite capable of dealing with themselves, but nevertheless they've got these rules and regulations that everyone seems to think we have to follow. And laws are being made to make sure we do follow them, or to try and make sure we follow them. I personally try and break as many of them as possible.
Well done. Well done. Um, you know, it's interesting to see how such a world can almost gallop away into problematic states like you're describing, whether it's the free-floating anxiety or too much regulation, too much bureaucracy. Part of it is, there's a question as much as a statement, is, I guess, a fundamental ignorance that of the premise of the human givens approach, which is that people really have very basic needs. And if their context does not permit them to have those needs met, there will be a lot of anxiety, misery, and strange behaviors from there forward.
Yeah.
Does that mean that this basic premise that you've taken forward, at least in the world of psychology, should be better understood more generally as a kind of baseline?
I think so. I think it should be taught in schools that people have innate needs, and we should respect the fact that people have those innate needs and help them cater for them as well as possible. And of course, good schools do that with children, but not all of them. And it's interesting that you used the word context there, because context is everything. We did a workshop on that, which some people would have attended that's listening to this, I hope. And that was really, really fundamental. Everything changes according to the context, and the context is constantly changing. So, for example, a child brought up in a home where there's no books and no opportunity to hear a wider view of things or alternative views of things, because you should look at things from multiple viewpoints, not just one or two. The idea that people say, "Oh, there's two sides to everything." Actually, there's hundreds of sides to everything. There's no two ways to look at things alone. Um, and that if a child isn't brought up with that idea in their minds, that you can challenge any statement and look at it from other points of view, and that's a very useful thing to do to develop your thinking ability. And I hate to use the word critical thinking because it's sort of linked to some rather unsavory ideas like critical race theory and all the rest of it. Yes, I think it should start as a basic premise in schools.
Well, when I think about if I have a very strong opinion about something, it can be due to two reasons. One is I'm just very emotionally invested in the idea.
Mm.
Or the other reason could be I've just been conditioned over a lifetime to think a certain way, and I've never even thought twice about thinking otherwise. Could be cultural conditioning, could be just my own affinities. So are we talking about the ability of people to be less fixated due to those states? Is that fundamentally what you're referring to by seeing things in many perspectives?
Yes, it's actually a spiritual exercise. You look at things in multiple dimensions as much as possible, and that's a tradition in the Jewish tradition and the mystical traditions around the world. You don't just look at it from one dogmatic point of view. In fact, dogma is one of the huge problems that the world faces, is overcoming the dogmas that have got entrenched into different societies. So yes.
So if we take it, let's say, to a political level, let's take any issue, I don't know, let's say migration in the UK, which is a very hot issue. Does that mean that every person really who's either affected by it or involved in it should try to see it from obviously their own position and their own biases, but also from the position of the migrant, from the position of the country as a whole, which is maybe different than one's own, from the position of policymakers, et cetera, sort of see it in the round? Is that, just to take a practical example, is that what we're
Yeah,
talking about?
I think so. I think you have to look at these issues from multiple viewpoints always. And, there's points of view that can raise an awful lot of emotions in people. And if people focus on them, they'll get highly emotional and therefore open to hypnotic preachers who sort of rant and rave about a problem in society. And there is a big problem in this country with a massive amount of immigrants coming in.
Ivan, let me take us back to kind of slightly big picture again, because I want to go back to something that certainly I'm noticing in my life and all around, and I think it's due to technology and due to desire of political and business systems to control and grow, which is what you referred to earlier, and a huge amount of regulation of human activity.
Mm.
Almost anything we do takes a lot of steps, has a lot of security dimensions to it. Now, not only does that lead to kind of frustration at the individual level of even trying to do something small that becomes very, very complicated. What are some of the other implications of having a society that is so regulated? And specifically, what I'd like to ask you about is trust. How does that affect everyday trust between people or their outlooks towards government, etc.?
Yeah. Well, you can't have a civilization without trust, just as you can't have a marriage without trust. You need trust to move people together, to buy and sell, you have to trust your banks, you have to trust your politicians, you have to trust the shopkeepers that they're not diddling you, they're not cheating you. And so if you don't have that level of trust, you've got no civilization, or the civilization's sort of crumbling. And the trust levels in the last sort of 40 or 50 years are largely going down. I mean, there is some researchers saying, no, they're going up a bit. But the more people you talk to, there is less trust in that things are going to work, for example. You try and order something or get something done online, for example, and it's quite hard, to get people to talk to you because it's all done now by computers and tick boxes and computers. And that has broken down individual trust between people. And if you don't have that face-to-face trust in somebody, you become very confused and angry, and it's not a healthy way to run a country. The whole thing about having rules and regulations overriding people's ability to use their own initiative and to be resilient in their own way and to solve problems themselves is a real difficulty because it's dumbing people down. That whole swathe of people are becoming more stupid because they're not allowed to do things that their grandparents could have done without batting an eye. It'd been easy for them. So I think that's a big, big problem with too much bureaucracy. And we've had a revolution, this last 100 years in the way our country's run and the way we do things now with computers and everything's speeded up and communications around the world. You can talk to people the other side of the world all the time, for free, just as we're talking for free here. And Kafka came out with a wonderful saying, which I can't remember. He said, after every revolution comes the slime of bureaucracy. And I think he's absolutely right. Bureaucracy in excess is like a slime that gets over everything and destroys people, destroys organizations that were working perfectly well when they were much simpler. And you're absolutely right that when something's not working, people, instead of saying, oh, well, we'll have to abandon that and start again, they say we just need to do more of the same, more of the same, more rules and regulations, more Europe, they say, as I've heard them say in Brussels, when we went over there. All we need is more Europe and everything will be all right. I think the person who's done most to help explain the mess we're in is Ian McGilchrist. As I'm sure most people know by now, he is a great neuroscientist and a philosopher and psychiatrist. And he has produced these books, The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things, which actually, if you take the time and the trouble to read them, and they're easy to read, there's just a lot of them in terms of number of pages, but they're wonderful. He says that the main problem we have is that we have two hemispheres, and one hemisphere is actually in the process of destroying the world now because it's taken over the way organizations and institutions are run. And it's true, so you can see it everywhere you look. It just becomes part of your knowledge base, really, that the left hemisphere wants to manipulate, to control, to measure, but it doesn't have understanding. It doesn't have the bigger picture, which is in the right hemisphere, and it has taken over. He had this wonderful notion in the title of his first big book, which was The Master and His Emissary, that the master is really the right hemisphere. And his emissary is the left hemisphere who goes out and fixes things, does things to the master's direction, but then starts to think it knows everything. And that's what happens now. So you can talk, I speak to people around and about who, got PhDs and all sorts of things, but they're very intellectual and they think they know everything, or they talk in such a way that they must be right, and people who aren't like them are wrong. And that is the sort of thing that Ian McGilchrist talks about, and his talks and interviews on YouTube are just priceless. They're wonderful. They're actually a sign that there is hope for us, because we can understand why we're getting into the mess we're getting in. But the problem is the left hemisphere is what creates tyrannies, not the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is always looking out, wanting to learn and wanting to grow understanding and expanding context. And really, expanding context right out into the whole universe is what a spiritual path is. It's get a bigger context all the time. The left hemisphere is doing the exact opposite. He wants to pin everything down to minuscule points of order, which it will then make rules and regulations that you have to follow, and gets very angry if you don't follow them because it thinks it's right and that you should do what it says. And I think that is a wonderful explanation for why the world is in such a mess now, and increasingly so. I mean, it's much more complicated perhaps than I've just spelt out there, but it's wonderful work that he's done, and we should explore and treasure it.
I know you've done a very interesting talk on YouTube about the rise and fall of civilizations.
Mm.
I suppose one could think that the fall is related to left hemisphere excess and taking us right down to the bottom. Can you tell us more about what you've learned by examining why civilizations rise and fall? Is there a pattern? And then maybe over to the hope side of things after that. We'll come back to that.
Yes, we must end on a positive note. There's no question about that. Well, in terms of the rise and fall of civilizations, all civilizations start in a very sort of vigorous way. And they usually start when there's hunger. People need land, they need food, and so they have to expand. And in the past, the great civilizations expanded onto the nearest one that was not as strong as they were, and hence there were battles and takeovers and so on all across Asia and Europe, as nations fought with one another for in order to get the basic needs met, food, water, and so on. And and then once they became successful like that, they started to trade. The trading, of course, is wonderful. And trade is brilliant because it's an interchange not only of goods and services but also ideas, and that's partly how civilizations became the culture for wise people. Because the universities could be set up as they were throughout Asia and Middle East and Europe, through these ideas being amongst wiser people, being spread through trade. But then what happens is people start to get rich and wealthy, and the vigor drains away from them, and they can become more and more corrupt, more bureaucratic means of extracting money from the poorer people to the richer people. This is happening now. So we've got poor people, very poor people, and we've got incredibly wealthy people, and that's a pattern that you see throughout the ages. And then it starts to degenerate and slide downhill. Things start to go wrong, and during that period, for example, we set up, as we started to go downhill, we set up the welfare state, which takes away the need for people to struggle. And you have to struggle. You have to have a certain amount of struggle to become strong and independent as an individual, as a family, and as a community. But if everything's just given to you on a plate in a welfare state, General John Glubb, first pointed that out to me, and I thought that was an amazing insight. It's so obviously true. So, and then it just collapses. Civilizations, there hasn't been a civilization on this planet that hasn't collapsed, hasn't gone down. So we shouldn't think that we're an exception to that. And then it's the ones that take over your civilization, or inveigle themselves into it and then take it over, that are going to be the source, perhaps, if we're lucky, of another civilization, which will take on all the knowledge that we've accumulated and take it to an even more evolved state. That's my hope, anyway.
Well, I was going to ask you, where do you think we are? And we, I mean now Western societies. Where are we on this curve that you've just described? What's your sense of where we are?
Well, I think we're degenerating fast. There's more corruption than ever in the planet, because the sums of money are so vast, massive amount of corruption. The media, it generates massive amount of emotionally arousing entertainment. So it's bread and circuses, that old pattern that goes, the Romans used to call it bread and circuses. So you entertain the masses and you give them enough food to survive on, and that'll keep them in their place. And that's what's happening to us, Netflix and the media, entertaining people, keeping them in their on their sofas and so on. So that's the circuses, and the bread is the welfare state. But there's not a healthy place to be for a human being. You see, there's several types. This is interesting thought, I think. There's several types of approaches to looking at human beings and the society. One is an informational approach, but information, as Ian McGilchrist said, is just data points. That's all it is. It means nothing without the bigger context, and it's only when you put those data points together and start to see a bigger pattern and a bigger context in which they fit, that you begin to develop a degree of knowledge. But knowledge is not the same as wisdom. Wisdom is when you can act from knowledge in a sensible, practical way, in tune with reality. And we don't seem to be encouraging people to do that. We seem to be drowning people in information and entertainment. I mean, I was quite amazed when I discovered that research into supermarkets, when they first became the big thing back in the 50s and 60s. And people were literally passing out, fainting in the aisles because there was so much choice. The human brain, doesn't like too much choice. And it was, I mean, we've got used to it now, so we put up with it. But too much choice of ideas, of products, food, and so on is unsettling to human beings.
Well, first of all, this very idea that there's information and then there's knowledge and then there's wisdom, and that one leads to the other, but each level is actually a larger, deeper level. This very idea is not very pervasive in the world, and which is what you just said, really. And I think it's important to just emphasize it, just the very fact that we need to progress from one to the next to the next.
Yes.
And that act of progression is healthy. But let me come back to this idea about limits, or yeah, about limits to things. You mentioned the shopping experience and being overwhelmed by the number of choice of cereal boxes, and I've had that experience quite often myself. So, what is the relationship between knowing things and containing that knowledge within limits? Can you explain a bit more about that? I think you and Joe Griffin developed that idea a bit about that the more you know, the fewer your options are in a way, because you've contained the world in a more coherent. What can you? I'm not explaining it very well. Maybe you
No, no,
can.
that's absolutely right. I'd forgotten we talked about that, but we did. And it was quite clear. Part of my knowledge is that the more options you have, or think you have, in fact, it's not helpful because you have to limit those options down. And once you know, for example, the quickest way to the nearest town, you will not, there's 100,000 other ways to get to the town. You could go all the way up to the north of Scotland to get to it if you wanted to, but it's only 6 miles away from where I live. So that would be ridiculous. But so once you've narrowed down the best option, that's the one you'll use 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100. So that's something that the human brain needs. And you see, that's one of the advantages of the left hemisphere. It does have a lot of good things going for it. The two hemispheres are really two completely different ways of apprehending things, apprehending the world. So the inclusive, specific way of explicit way of doing it is the left hemisphere way, and it's focused, very focused. Whereas the right hemisphere is implicit. Everything's implicit to the right hemisphere, and it can see the nature of things through metaphor. The right hemisphere has that ability to read context in a way that the left hemisphere doesn't have. And that's why it should be in control of our behavior and directing the left hemisphere to do just what we need to limit our options to practical, healthy options, rather than the left hemisphere thinking, oh no, we can do this, we can do that, and we can spread ourselves thin and it doesn't matter. It does matter, actually.
Well, we live in a world that is clearly very polarized politically and socially. The United States, even the United Kingdom, people of one ideology just can't accept the view of the other. We've done a lot of work on this about the role of groupthink and how that affects that. But I think it also comes down to what you're suggesting about the different outlooks within us.
Mm.
Ian McGilchrist gets into this in quite a bit of detail. The ability to live with opposites, including, for example, that the left and right brain are opposites of each other, but they live together. They have to. The idea that opposites need each other, that there's no mountain without the valley. And to take it to the politics, there's no right without the left and no left without the right. And we've come to a point where they don't know how to coexist. How can in your view, how can opposites live better together? What's the outlook that permits that?
Well, it's developing greater knowledge leading to wisdom, basically. That's what you need. You're absolutely right. You can't have light without dark. You can't have heat without cold. And those opposites uh, come together. You can't describe heat unless you can describe cold, for example. And that's the same with amongst people. You can have really stupid people and really intelligent people, but they have to come. That's how you measure things. How you can appreciate the qualities of both. Because a lot of people that some intelligent people would think were not very bright are actually bright at some things that they can't do. Um, but just because they haven't got a degree in plumbing, for example, the intellectual is absolutely useless when the sink starts leaking and they have to call in a plumber. And boundaries are important. So a boundary is to do with the two opposite, which do with opposites. Boundaries between countries, between counties, between governments. Those boundaries are really critically important. And, this is a truism from psychotherapy and education as well. You have to establish boundaries between yourself and your patient or yourself and your student. You have to. If you don't, you get into big problems, not just emotional problems, but all kinds of problems. The child doesn't know where he gets more confused and the teacher gets more hopeless.
Yes, I think this whole idea of being able to see that something that is different than you can help. In fact, it's probably essential to you moving forward, even if it seems an enemy, even, is very difficult for people to grasp.
Yeah.
Um, the other dimension of that I've noticed is opposites create tension between each other, and that's actually a useful thing because tension can may help you like move forward to actually be dynamic. You need opposition, actually. You can't, if everything's the same, nothing happens, to put it in a simple way.
Well, my favorite old proverb, if you've got no problems, buy a goat. You actually need problems, and problems create tension, and
Exactly.
tension moves things on.
Yeah. Um, Ivan, if we could shift gear a bit now and take it to you've written a very interesting memoir. So I'm going to take it to the personal level a bit. Um, your memoir is called Listening to Idris Shah, who you knew and had met and had worked with in many ways. Um, I reread your memoir recently, and it's in my view, it really is a tale about personal learning throughout life
Mm.
in small ways, big ways. Tell us a bit about what you've learned about a good life. What are some of the most important aspects? Many of us escape from learning. We run away from it. We want comforts. We want the breads and circuses you referred to earlier.
Yes,
You seem to dive into things and just,
I did dive into things which a lot of people thought was foolish at the time, and indeed I often wondered if I was being foolish. But I did dive into businesses and um, relationships and so on. Um, and it's important to do that. It's important to have a go at things. If doors open, keep walking through them and seeing where they lead. You can't predict exactly what's going to happen in your life. And if you have an aim in life to get somewhere and you uh, come across difficulties, if you struggle for a bit, but if those difficulties keep them coming alive, to you and stopping you, become obstacles, um, choose some other route, somewhere to go, because you've got to keep busy. You've got to have your brain being exercised by the problems that you've got to overcome to achieve anything. And so, but what I learned really was I learned all that sort of thing from listening to Idris Shah talking, and the stories he used to tell us, and reading his books, which I recommend to anybody. He was always going on about how you need problems, you need to have a business, you need to have an aim in life, and it's something you're trying to achieve. And it almost doesn't matter what it is, as long as you're doing that. You know, it can be anything. So it can be, you could, well, I mean, that's why I leapt into doing psychotherapy by chance and circumstances, and partly because I was interested in hypnosis. So I started off learning about hypnosis because I'd had an operation under hypnosis when I was 15. And I was surprised to find that my teachers at school didn't believe in it. But I knew it was true because I'd experienced it. So one of the most important things to do is to experience stuff, not just theoretically, you know, by reading a book thinking you know how to do something. You have to actually do it. You can't learn to swim by reading a book, for example. You have to get in the water.
But wait a minute now, that does involve being ready to live with uncertainty and risk.
Absolutely, yeah.
And most people aren't that comfortable with uncertainty and risk, number one. And number two, we're in a society that goes out of its way to mitigate, actually, to make risk disappear, actually, the opposite.
Yeah.
What do you say to people who want to avoid who don't want uncertainty and risk in their life, that they view that as a bane? What do you say to that?
Well, I can't say anything to them. They've got to learn the hard way, haven't they? That's not going to get them anywhere. I mean, that's not my job or your job, or anybody's job, really. You just create a world around yourself as much as possible to show that if you take risks, it's like in a relationship. Unless you have to take a relationship, you have to jump in and take a. I mean, one of the most terrifying things I ever did was to phone up my current wife and ask her out. You know, in my middle age, and it was so nerve-wracking. You know, quite a frightening risk. I am also risk averse, you know, but you have to do it if you're going to if you want something. So there we are.
Yeah, in other words, if you want the results, there's no way to avoid the uncertainty and the risk.
That's right. I mean, it's very common for people to make jokes about health and safety in this country, because health and safety seems to get in the way of just about anything really enjoyable. These people come along, these what do they call them? What's that Russian word for them?
Apparatchiks.
That's the word. Thank you. Apparatchiks or whatever. Yeah. So the apparatchiks come in and tell you what you can and can't do, and we make fun of them, and we should make fun of them. But of course, if you make fun of them and they're in charge of a tyranny that can put you in prison or have you shot, as happens in the Soviet Union and in Germany during the Nazi socialist period, yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, Ivan. Thanks very much for a lot of these views. Some are controversial, but again, that goes to exactly what you just said, which is that people should be challenged, and your very ideas, I think, will challenge some people. But that's part of their purpose, because is to make people think about their own position.
In my experience, though, people don't really want to think. Once they've got their fixed view, they will stick to it, and they won't look at other ways of looking at things, generally speaking. And I think that's why our civilization's going down.
Ivan, there's a thread throughout this conversation that we can talk about a bit more, which is you mentioned a couple of times that, for example, engaging with greater and greater contexts is a spiritual road, and that there's a hierarchy between information, knowledge, and wisdom. Now, the word spiritual, in my view, is a bit dangerous because it means so many different things to different people that I dare not tread there.
No, I quite agree. Me too.
But what is your understanding of what people refer to as the spiritual? How do you see it in your life? And it's a kind of growth, I suppose, a personal growth. And what are we talking about there? How can others understand it a bit better, is sort of what I'm asking you.
Well, you can't attach new knowledge without there being knowledge in a person first. And you've got to have knowledge before you can approach wisdom and enlightenment, if you like. So it starts off, firstly, with the innate needs of human beings, because they're given to us. That's why we call it the human givens. They're given to us by nature. And that's a form of knowledge. So a baby knows it needs milk from its mother's nipple, for example, and it knows it needs to breathe, and it knows it needs to cry to attract attention when it's uncomfortable, and so on. And that's knowledge. And gradually, as the baby grows, you attach new knowledge to the existing knowledge. And that should continue throughout the child's education. And as we become adolescent and adult, you're always attaching new knowledge, or you should be hoping to attach new knowledge to existing knowledge. There's not something that you come in and say, here's your quota of spirituality, or here's your quota of intellectual wisdom, or whatever. It's not like that. It's a continuing process where you just add all the time. You add to what you are and what you know more and more. And when you have a degree of knowledge, sometimes you can do things, not always, but sometimes you can do things which appear to other people to be quite wise, But who knows? It's,
Mm.
I think it's a question of getting the fundamentals right. That's why all the traditions, the mystical traditions, have a range of stories and practices that encourages people to take up. But then what happens is the left hemisphere gets involved and starts turning them into dogmas. And so the spiritual drive, if you like, gets destroyed more often than it releases human beings to exist on a higher plane.
And getting the fundamentals right means getting the fundamentals right in your own life. It means, more specifically, what are you referring to? Meeting basic needs? What
Well,
does
all
that
those,
look
all
like?
those things, and but also being able to put up with what happens when you don't get your needs met. You have to tolerate uncertainty and discomfort, as we were talking about earlier. Um, so it's not a cut and dried thing at all. Um, but you learn by what you do and by what you achieve in your life. You learn from all those things, and everybody should be on a path of doing that, not just enjoying the circuses all the time, as it were.
This important idea, because many people have illusions about growing wiser. And in a world that's so full of distractions, I know I suffer from this. We've concocted a universe of endless distraction.
Yeah,
It's there's
it's mad.
it's not easy to keep the eye on the ball, is it?
Right.
To sincerity, meaning what are you really after, is a pretty important question, isn't it?
Yeah, I know you can meet people who are trying to go on these expensive workshops to align their DNA to their chakras or their chakras to their DNA and things like this. I mean, this is true. I know people that do that sort of thing. I've met them, and they're totally sincere, but also um, less wealthy after they've been on these things because they have to spend quite a bit of money on them. So the world is full of charlatans and dead ends, if you like. But basically, you just live an ordinary life, do all the things you have to do, get the washing in, and, and so on. And uh, if you focus on reading and absorbing material that has been presented to us throughout the centuries, actually, by in all different cultures and the great mystics, as you alluded to Taoism right earlier on, and from then on, there's always been people who've left clues, signposts, if you like, as to what we need to be doing. And if people really want to have some sort of spiritual life, then they need to pay attention to those.
What's always amazed me actually is that if you look at a crosscut of philosophical, mystical, or religious writing from across the world, is how similar they are actually.
Yeah,
And one's mind can get around the cultural dimensions and see them in a certain way. Goes back to what we were saying earlier about seeing things from different angles.
yeah,
They're all attending to the same truth in a different format, but they are all doing that.
yes.
It's encouraging.
It is, I'm sure it goes back many thousands of years. There's evidence that it does. That there is a knowledge in human beings, a wisdom tradition, and we should pay attention to it. It's far more important than listening to the latest Netflix series or listening to politicians ranting on.
Well, I was just about to ask you, do you think there can be any wisdom in politics at all? Or is that asking too much?
Well, I think there probably have been some wise politicians, but they're thin on the ground.
Hmm. Can you think of some?
Not offhand, no. But I mean, I know I've read quotes from politicians, and I thought, well, man, he knows a thing or two.
Yeah, the one who comes to my mind, which I always use as an example, is one of the first Secretary Generals of the United Nations, Tag Hammarskjöld, the Swede,
Yeah.
in the late 50s, early 60s. I think he was quite a personally wise man, and then put that wisdom into action in his work quite directly. I think he's one example, but there are probably others.
I think there are others from Victorian times, that, but I'm not well up on those. I haven't studied
Mm.
them. But yeah, I think you're
Well,
right.
Ivan, to the degree that I know you and have read your books, and you've written many books, but including your memoir, to me, your life is a testament of exactly what we've just spoken about for the last 10 minutes, which is someone who's learned and expanded himself and his knowledge and his relations with others by living. And as you said, it can be by living an ordinary life. It doesn't have to be an extraordinary life at all, which
Mm,
is something that these days is not always remembered properly.
that's
So
right.
thank you for sharing these insights with us, these many, many insights about so many different issues. Um, Thank you for joining us at this podcast, and look forward to more very soon.
Well, nice to meet you again, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan.